Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April edition of Spark Freedom's Spark Sessions webinar broadcast. My name is Lassa, and I'm really excited for the topic that we have today. We've got a great guest for the show today as well. And anyway, Spark Sessions are a monthly webinar that we do here at Spark Freedom. We want our nonprofit partners and people in the nonprofit community to have the best in marketing and communications knowledge. And so we typically do about 30 minutes or so of conversation with a guest expert, people like Kevan. And but we also want you to be a part of the broadcast. We want to interact with you. So we've got someone stationed on our Twitter account, which you can find at twitter.com/sparkfreedom. And you can also use the hashtag Spark Reframe for this specific webinar. You can also see that on the lower third here on the video. So if you have questions or if you have comments or if you want to discuss the topic as we're talking about it with the other viewers that are watching it, please jump onto Twitter, get that conversation going. And if you have questions that you would like to address to Kevan or I, Megan, who's monitoring our Twitter account, will be watching. She'll be watching for those questions and she'll be passing them along to us. And we will get to those at the end of the broadcast. And then finally, before we dive in, we have a post-event survey that we would love to share with you. We'd love to get your feedback on what you think about the topic that we're talking about today. If you've had any technical recommendations for how we do the broadcast, we want these things to be the best that they can possibly be. It's about a 1 to 2 minute survey. So if you pre-registered for this event, we'll be emailing you that link. If you didn't pre-register, if you just stumbled across it or you found us via social media, we'll share that link out on Twitter. So just be watching for that at the end of the broadcast. Okay, now that we've got the housekeeping taken care of, I'd love to introduce our guest, Kevan Kjar. Kevan, you've been a longtime friend. You're a good friend of mine. You're a trusted business partner for Spark Freedom. We're really excited to have you on today to talk about objection reframes. But before we dive into that topic, can you just share with our viewers a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, good morning, Lassa. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending upon where you are in the country. Lassa, what I do when organizations have a really tough or complicated product to sell and they have a hard time getting everybody on board to say the same thing, we come in and bring their leadership team together so that they're all saying the same thing and they zero in on what is the most important value that they have to provide. That value, that purpose we call the arrowhead. And when everybody is in alignment around that, we help them with different ways to communicate that in a passionate way. And occasionally when they are communicating their message, there's sometimes objections that come up. And so we help them to reframe them, and which is obviously what we'll talk about later today. So I help people find, tell, and be their best story is what I like to say.
Great. Okay, well, and what is our relationship like? How do you work with Spark Freedom? How do we fit together from your perspective? So just to give people context about why we work together and how we work together.
Probably about 3 or 4 years ago, I was asked to do some work with Spark Freedom, and in doing that work, we came in and my first exposure to Nicole Williams, and we started working together. And one of the things that we do really well is we bring people together and help them come up with a message. But one of the things I don't do well is once I'm done with that, I'm on to the next client. But as you can imagine, once you determine what your message is for a certain policy, there's a lot of work that needs to happen behind the scenes with the campaign so that people are true to the message and they know what to do and they get some coaching. And that's been the blessing of knowing both Nicole and Spark Freedom, because they do that very well and they are complementary to what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really exciting. You know, I've had the opportunity to work with you in a lot of cases, and it's really exciting to be able to come together and offer a really high quality product and service to our clients and really give them that extra mile. So, all right, Kevan, help us understand, what is an objection reframe?
Great question. So let's just say you have a child and your child is starting to come into kindergarten when they start getting some of those first vaccines. And the child says, but Daddy, I don't want to get a shot. The shot hurts. That's an objection. Well, there's a few different ways you can respond to that. And we'll bring into a reframe here in just a minute. First way you could do it is you could deny it and say, no, shots don't hurt. Just go get the shot. The shot does not hurt. And the child goes and gets the shot and then realizes mom and dad is a liar. That's not a good way. Another thing you could do is you could argue with them. And you could say, yeah, the shot hurts, but you're going to get it anyhow. Or the third thing you could do is you could take that a step further and threaten them. And you could say, yeah, the shot's going to hurt, but if you don't get the vaccine, I'll give you something that will really hurt. In essence, what you're doing is you're asking them to exchange one fear for another fear. That's a little bit like a reframe, but a reframe doesn't come across as a threat. A reframe is when you say, you recognize, yeah, shots do hurt, but honey, if we don't get a shot, then we might be, you might be susceptible. Don't say susceptible to a 5-year-old. You say, if you don't do that, you might get sick. Something sick that's far more worse than a shot. And so whenever there is a greater concern, that's the key word, a greater concern than the original fear, then you can use a reframe, because a reframe, you're asking them to take their one concern and you're asking them to exchange it for the greater concern. So in this case, the fear is the shot hurts, and the greater concern is, yeah, but if you don't, you might get polio. You might get something else that's going to hurt them even more. So that, in essence, that is what a reframe is.
Okay. And how does that fit into the context of what you do for people?
Okay, so a lot of times the people on the left are very good at pointing out things that are tough about our argument. You know, they're hard or it takes time, and they don't mince words about pointing those things out. Perhaps one of the best objections I came across, and I'm going to ask Lassa to share a couple of videos here. Go back to 1984, Reagan. He's campaigning for his second term as president, and the other side threw up an objection, and the objection was, this man will be the oldest president. We don't want him to be president. And then they would use the phrase, we're one heartbeat away from Dan Quayle. And so in one of the debates, this particular objection came up, and watch how Reagan handled this. Okay, Lassa, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead and finish your thought.
So Reagan, he gets the objection, and instead of denying it, he accepts it, but then he reframes it and asks everybody to replace it with a greater concern. Go ahead.
I am not going to exploit. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
So that's a classic.
Yeah.
And you notice Reagan, he didn't argue with it. He didn't deny it. He accepted it and then said, and you know what? There's another concern. Would we ever want to have a president that has less experience? Now contrast that to how a few years later, Dan Quayle and Benson are not. I made a statement that we were one footstep away from Quayle. We were one heartbeat away from George Bush. He was the vice president at the time. I misspoke myself, folks. I'm not a political animal. All right, so 1988, Quayle is running for vice president. Lloyd Benson from Texas is running for vice president. And so they're debating one another. And watch what happens when Quayle sets himself up and then Benson has the objection ready, and obviously Quayle's not ready for it.
Presidency. Senator, I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
Okay.
Did that?
Another great video.
We didn't get to play the rest of that clip.
Oh, sorry about that.
Well, I'll just say what he said. He said, Senator, that was uncalled for. And then Benson replied with, well, you were the one that brought it up, Senator. So he just decided to argue with it. Here's the backstory there. Reagan knew that he was going to be getting that objection. And so he and his coach at the time, Roger Ailes, sat down for 3 hours to determine how to respond and helped Reagan practice for 3 hours to get it over and over again until he was ready to deliver it. On the other hand, Quayle had not prepared for that, but Benson, in his murder row practice, they said, you know, he compares himself to Kennedy a lot. And in that practice, Benson said, you're kidding me. He does not. No, he does. Well, I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine, and he's no Jack Kennedy. And they said, say exactly that. So he scripted it, had it memorized. So when the time came and when Quayle made the statement, aides that were sitting there watching it turned to the donors and said, here it comes. And he delivered it and knocked him out of the park. So on one hand, Reagan was ready for the objection and had a reframe there. On the other hand, Quayle was not ready and got nailed for it.
Okay, so preparation was absolutely key in those examples, right? The guy that didn't prepare fell on his face. The guy that did prepare won the day. How can the groups that we work with, nonprofit communication professionals, prepare themselves for these kinds of objections?
Well, my guess is each of you out there, you know what your objections that you're going to get. It may be having to do with your organization. You're a new organization, and why would I put money to you versus a politician? Or it might be issue related. And it's, you guys are always trying to circumnavigate and stop regulations. Well, regulations are good. Or it might be more personal. You're too young. You shouldn't have the experience that I would count on. So I want to deal with somebody that's older. So you know what objections you're going to get, either around your organization, around your issue, or it might be around you personally. So prepare for those objections. Know what they are and have responses that are ready. In most cases, a reframe will work. So for example, if somebody says, well, let's see, you and I've worked with somebody in the past, and this particular person was concerned because they had very little experience. However, where they went to school had a great deal of specialization in this space of freedom. And so we helped her to realize that where she worked or where she went to school, she had something very great to offer. And so she then reframed that and accepted the idea, yeah, I may be young, but I'm also fresh with ideas, and the training I've gotten at this particular university is unlike anything that anyone else has had, which makes me specially qualified to help you in this situation, which increased her confidence as well. So know what your objections are and be ready to address the three toughest ones.
Okay. In the past, at least some of the exercises that we've done to help people prepare, and I know you mentioned this a little earlier on the webinar, you talked about a murder row or a murder board. Can you describe a little bit what that is and how it helps people prepare for their toughest objections?
Murder rows are a blast. So when we come in, we typically don't do this on a first engagement because you really need to know what your message is and you need to have some stories behind it. So on one particular issue, can I mention what the issue is, Lassa, or do I have to keep it confidential?
I think if you're thinking of the one I'm thinking of, I think we have to keep it confidential for now.
Okay, so there was a particular issue, and we came back and did a second pass with them. They knew what their message was, but then they came across several great stories. And we did a murder row. So we took 3 people that were going to be the national spokespersons on this particular topic. And the group determined what would be the toughest objections that they would get. And the group had already brainstormed several reframes and several analogies, stories, and metaphors to use. So then these 3 people, we then in a role play situation where like they were candidates, we would say, okay, Tom, so, and then we would give them the objection. And that person would stand up and respond to it in about 30, 45 seconds. And then when they were done, the whole group would coach them. Hey, I really liked how you did this. What if you said this? And they get some really good coaching. Person number 2 gets the same objection. Well, they get to benefit from the coaching from the first person. They get up, do a little bit better job, and then they get some coaching when they're done. Then the third person, they're really teed up to really knock it out of the park, and they typically do. They give their own response, and then based on the previous coaching, they're ready for it. Then we go through with the next objection. Well, instead of starting with person 1, we start with person 2. So everybody gets a chance to be the guinea pig on the first one. Now, that's a murder row, and they're fantastic, very capable. And I saw firsthand on a video where one of these people, a week later, they were asked to testify in front of the Federal Elections Commission in Washington, D.C., and they were testifying in front of the vice chair, who is very well known as being very progressive and very liberal. And what was really cool about this situation, there was one particular objection that was the nail in our coffin. It was the Achilles heel that we were always afraid of. But because they murder boarded this particular objection, at the very end of his testimony, they didn't give him the objection yet. Well, he had such a great reframe. He said, now I'm sure some of you are thinking that, and then he gave the objection, and then he went right into the reframe. Well, you know, it's a lot like, and then he backed it up with stories and proof, knocked it out of the park. In fact, the vice chair was so irritated that you could hear her say, you have 1 minute, sir. And but he delivered it beautifully, and he now is on record with that particular reframe. So
awesome.
Murder boarding is all about prepping you for your toughest objections.
So you described in the exercise, you know, we did a town hall style scenario, and the individual you just described, he went and testified. What are the other places that you can use objection reframes?
Anytime you're going to get somebody that disagrees with you, it may be in a one-on-one conversation. It may be a telephone call, maybe a conference call, maybe a webinar like this. Somebody's out there thinking, yeah, Kevin, but whatever. There's going to be an objection. Anytime, you always want to have that dialogue, that interaction with the person you're trying to persuade, and always be ready for that objection. Sometimes those objections are placed there for ill intent because they want to see you crash and burn and die, or it may be a genuine concern that they don't know how to respond to, and your ability to help them reframe that will help them so that they can become more on your side.
Great. So can you dive into a little bit on the technical aspect? Explain the concept of framing itself, and then we'll talk about reframing. So
okay.
Start off with framing though.
All right, so let's say somebody has a concern. In their mind, they've framed a particular concern. Let's deal with a real issue. Let's say federal dollars. So a lot of different, the federal government likes to control the state governments, and the way that they do that is they do that with federal grants and so forth. We saw a lot of this in the healthcare debate. And so a lot of times people in states will say, well, of course we need to take those dollars. It's free money. We need to take that free money. And the original fear or the concern they have is if we don't take that money, it's going to go to some other state or someone else is going to get it, and we're going to be left poor and not be able to help support our citizens. That's the frame. That's how they see it. All right, so that's the frame. A reframe says there is a greater concern. And so you get them to put on take off those glasses and put on a new pair of glasses that says, I want you to recognize the greater concern. And so with free dollars or free money, what is the greater concern? Well, the greater concern is those free dollars comes with strings attached. And one of the best reframes I saw or heard was Jen Butler. She told the story about her husband coming home. They have wonderful little kids, and Jen likes to help teach her kids and see their pictures on Facebook all the time. And so her husband comes home with a little kitten, and she says, why are you bringing home a kitten? And he said, well, there was a sign that said free kittens. She looked at him and said, there are no such thing as free kittens. And then she explained to him, you have to feed them, you have to do the kitty litter, they're going to tear up everything, they're going to go to the bathroom everywhere. And then he began to understand, oh yeah, there are strings attached to a sign that says free kittens. And so she then used that in an argument about why federal dollars can be bad for us. Because if we don't recognize what the strings are and we don't evaluate those things, we may just be making a very bad decision and tying ourselves and becoming subservient to a federal government. So does that make sense? Between the frame is the original thought, the reframe is when you have something of greater concern. If you don't have a greater concern, and that's the frame is the greatest concern, a reframe is not going to work. Okay, it may, the child may say, but Daddy, I don't want to step in front of a moving truck. Yeah, there is no reframe for that one. You want them to be afraid of that moving truck, and so you accept that original frame. There is no reframe to that. You acknowledge it.
Yeah. How is the whole concept of objection reframes different than spin? I mean, you see PR wizards get up on at a press conference and they're fielding tough questions and they're able to dance their way out of just about anything. Is this that, or is this something different?
It all depends on your intent. Sometimes people use the word spin to mean reframe. Typically spin means it's a sleight of hand type of thing. It's pay no attention to this man behind the curtain. I want you to be paying attention over here. So you're literally saying, take your eyes off of this and watch this. A reframe is acknowledging that original fear and then helping them understand, but there's a greater concern you need to have. And so spin is really just saying, ignore this one and pay attention to this one. And sometimes it's done with an intent that's not genuine. I want you folks out there to be genuine. If there is an objection out there that you cannot overcome, it may be that your policy is not the right policy, and don't try and force it. Run away from it. You want something that's going to help you be genuine, and typical spin is normally not genuine. Reframes are.
Okay. So with that in mind, then you just mentioned that maybe an objection reframe may not work with all objections. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sometimes the objection is real and you can't overcome that. I'm trying to think of one right off the top of my head of one where you might say that is an objection, and you say, yeah, you got a great point. And I know in my for-profit business, when a salesperson is qualifying a prospect, they will look for several different traits to say this account is one that we should be serving. And so sometimes the questions will be, well, do you have this particular pain? Yes, we do. Okay, check number one. Is it something you're suffering from right now and you're willing to do something about? Yes. Okay, check number two. Do you have budget to do this? No, we don't. All right, that's an objection they can't overcome. So at that point, you don't reframe it and say, well, yeah, okay, but you might be able to. No, you accept it and you say, oh, let's move on. This is not a deal we want to be going after. In the policy space, Lassa, help me out. What would be an objection of something that you cannot reframe, that you just have to accept and say, yeah, that's right? And
now, I mean, some of the ones that we've addressed, which I thought were the toughest nuts to crack, we actually ended up coming up with some really great objection reframes. So I'm racking my brain right now trying to think of one that doesn't have an answer, or one that we would just have to accept and move forward with.
It's a rare case that you can't find a reframe.
But what does somebody do in that case? Is it better? I mean, one quote that I've heard you say before, that it's better to lose fast and lose small than to lose late and lose much.
Yes.
So can you maybe unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, in a sales situation, or let's say you're going after a donor, and the donor realizes they're going to give $100,000 to either this cause, or this cause, and they've ruled out cause number one, they've ruled out cause number two, and now there's you and another cause that is left, and you folks spend weeks vying for that attention, and only to find out that you lose and the other group wins that donor dollars. Well, you just spent a lot of time and got nothing out of it. If you're going to lose early and lose fast, because there is no, it's like the Olympics. There's no such thing as second place. Silver just means you were the best loser and best among all the other losers. So winning matters.
You have a cutthroat approach to competition.
Well, it is. It's binary. I mean, they don't give you, you don't get an award for second place in sales.
Yeah.
And, you know, the same thing is true with ideas. If your policy is not embraced, it's not there. So, and sometimes what will happen is an objection that cannot be reframed is typically an indication that your policy is not up to snuff.
So in that case, go back and tinker with the policy, make it the right answer, and then you have a leg to stand on when you go out and face objections.
They just gave you a gift. They told you, here's a flaw in your policy, and you can now go fix it rather than go to market with a policy and then find out later.
So don't rely on marketing to spin it, or don't rely on your communications team to spin it. Tinker with the policy, make sure that it's solid, and then your communications team is going to be equipped to be able to reframe the objections.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Great. Well, and Kevin, I know you have some tips to help us, once we've developed our objection reframes, delivering them with passion and effectively delivering them.
Okay.
You want to share some of that stuff with us?
All right, so folks, let's just say you get an objection, and you know what, Lassa, I'm going to need to take my headset off, so hopefully you can all still hear me. All right, can you still hear me, Lassa?
I can still hear you, yeah.
I can't hear you. Can you still hear me?
Unplug your headset, and then I think people will be able to hear through the built-in mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say you are giving a presentation, and somebody throws an objection at you. Okay, so Lassa, go ahead and throw an objection at me. Say your policy will never work. It takes too much time or something like that. So what do you think?
Kevin, your policy is just way too expensive. You're never going to be able to implement it. It's way too expensive. It's way too complex.
So if I understand you correctly, you're concerned that my policy is too expensive and it's just never going to work. Is that right? Okay. So what did I just say with my body? As I stepped backward, I said, I'm not comfortable with. Let's hit me with another objection. So what do you think?
I just don't think that it's reasonable to accept your policy within this time frame. It's going to take way too long to implement.
So if I understand you correctly, Lassa, you're concerned that this policy is just gonna take too long. Is that what I'm hearing, huh? Is that what I'm hearing? All right. So how did you feel, Lassa?
I felt a little violated, my personal space, even though we're talking over the computer. I was a little uncomfortable.
Did I come inside your purple bubble space? Okay, yeah. Okay, give it to me again. So, Lassa, what do you think?
I think that the policy you're suggesting is too expensive, too complex, and is going to take too long.
You know, that's an observation a lot of people have, that it does take a long time. And then I would launch into the reframe, which there's a lot of good reframes for time. And but notice what I did with my body. I took one step forward. So whenever you're going to get an objection, the last thing you want to do is move backwards. So let's say you're in a panel discussion and you're sitting down here. The last thing you want to do, when you know the moderator is going to ask, so are there any questions? Or if you say, are there any questions? Don't be leaning forward like this. Give yourself some space to move into. So when you say, so are there any questions? And they say, yeah, your policy is just going to take too long. You can then lean forward. It's the same thing as stepping into it. Or let's say you're on the telephone and somebody says, your policy is just going to take too long. One of the things that I teach people in communications, especially those that just work over the phone, is at that point, you might just want to stand up. There's something, when you stand up, your diaphragm, your voice, your tone, everything just sounds stronger, more confident. So don't get in their face, but use your body to move into it.
How do you deal with the stress of getting an objection? I know that I've gone out and I've done town hall meetings, and I've talked about policy. And when people would ask me the tough question, you know, my blood pressure goes up. You start to feel a little nervous, get the pit in your stomach. Do you have any tips for people for dealing with the stress of meeting some tough objections?
Well, if you will not fear. So preparation means you've practiced it, you know what you're going to say, and you've practiced it with other peers. So when you're in front of the customer, it's not the very first time you've delivered that reframe. You don't, or it's not the very first time. You don't want the first time to be in front of your customer. You want to have practiced it. So folks, in your staff meetings, it might be good to take some time to say, okay, what are some of the toughest objections we get? Either issue-oriented, organization-oriented, or personal, and brainstorm how you're going to respond to those, and then practice them. And that means role playing. Mm-hmm. And you practice it several times until it becomes second nature to you. And so always be ready for your top three. If you are prepared, you will not fear as much.
Yeah, preparation.
You still may be scared, but it's not going to be as much.
I feel like when you get in those crunch situations, you rely on instinct or reaction, right? And so what you're saying is make the preparation such that when you react the right way instead of the wrong way.
Yeah, it's a great way. It's the muscle memory. Create the muscle memory on that.
Great. Well, any last minute tips or thoughts, Kevin, as we wrap up this discussion about objection reframes?
You know, do we have time to show that one video clip that I told you about earlier?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just set this up just a little bit. Folks, let's say you are a prime minister of a country and your country has been under attack and you have responded, and your response has inadvertently killed citizens. Now, I'm going to show you this clip. I don't want anybody to walk away with the political. Kevin is out there advocating for Israel. I'm not doing that. What I'm advocating is you're about to see Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu respond to a very tough objection where the reporter is saying, your response to this violence is killing several citizens. He uses several different techniques to respond to this. So just watch, and they'll have a short discussion afterward, and then move and then finish up.
61 soldiers killed, 3 civilians. We've seen more than 1,800 people killed in Gaza, 900 or almost 1,000 of which are civilians estimated. Do you really feel that your actions, Israel's actions, were proportionate? And were you using the appropriate precision weapons, even if Hamas is using them as human shields? And the second question,
please,
if I may,
we want to. Can I ask one question?
Not
everyone will be able to ask if you do too. And we want to let as many people ask. Please.
Why don't you ask the first question? Let me answer that. Then you can ask the second question. Why don't we do that? So first of all, the answer to both your questions is yes. I think it was justified. I think it was proportional. And that doesn't in any way take away from the deep regret we have for the loss of a single civilian. We've gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid civilian casualties. Hamas has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that they have civilian casualties, as you've just seen. Now, let's imagine your country. Could be any country. Could be the US, could be Britain, could be Germany, France, India, you name it. Let's imagine your country attacked by 3,500 rockets. Your territory is infiltrated by death squads. What would you do? What would you demand that your government do to protect you and your family? You'd demand that, and you'd be right. Because security, protecting the people, is the first obligation of any government. But what if the rockets are fired from civilian areas, and the tunnels come from schools, from mosques, from private houses, where civilians live? Should you then not take action? Do the terrorists have immunity because of the fear that some civilians will unfortunately get hurt? Let me tell you what I think disproportionality is. It's not acting to defend your people and giving the terrorists the license to kill. I think that's disproportionate, and that's wrong.
Thanks, Lassa. So did y'all notice what he did there? So the original objection was, is it appropriate that you would respond and kill citizens? Well, at first glance, we would all probably agree and say, oh, you should never do that. But he responds with a reframe of something of greater concern. And that greater concern, he's weighing one value versus another. Yeah, we should never kill citizens. But what's more important is defending and protecting your people, your nation. And that's a hard thing to weigh, but he's saying, what would you do? And he laid out the scenario with some imagined statements and delivered the reframe beautifully. It was a tough reframe to deliver, but he delivered it very well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great video. It's a great example of objection reframes. I especially, you often use the spike of imagine, and he helps people visualize and internalize what it would be like to be in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Kevan, thanks for being on the broadcast with us today. Do you have any final closing thoughts before we wrap this up?
Just like I said before, folks, understand what a reframe is. In your professional life and in your personal life, you're going to use these all the time. So understand the concept of what a frame and a reframe is. And in your professional life right now, find out what your toughest 3 objections are, be they personal, issue, or organization oriented, and prepare yourself to deliver a reframe on that. And if you do that and you practice it, I promise you, your confidence is going to go up, and you're going to look at objections in an entirely new fashion. You're not always going to be afraid of them. You might embrace them just as Reagan did and secure the next nomination for president.
Kevan, do you have time for one question? You got a question from the audience? Okay.
Sure.
And I know we talked about this, but I think it's worth reiterating. The question is, should you address objections before they're brought up?
Should you address objections before they're brought up? You know, there's a lot of variables on something like that. You may have an objection that you really don't want to have come up, but if it does, you've got a response for it. And so you may just want to keep the objection there just in case. Or you may have such a great reframe that you are just dying for it to come up. It's like the Reagan, you know, you're too old to run for president, and you want the objection to come up, and if you don't get it, you're going to mention it itself. But one of the great things about mentioning the objection before it comes up is, in most cases, you are knocking the legs out of your accuser or knocking the legs out of the other side. And it really makes you appear stronger. So for the most part, if you can do that and you've got an good objection, it does knock the legs out of the other guys.
Great. Hey, Kevan, it's been great having you on this webinar. Lots of great information. If people have additional questions, is there a place that they can reach you?
Yeah, just my email, Kevan, Kevan, at arrowhead3.com. That's arrowhead and the number 3.com. Feel free to email me and we'll respond to your questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kevan, and thank all of you for tuning in for this webinar. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody.